So hello from Green-Mopeds. So today we're going to have a look at the NQiGTS Sport. And just as an aside, we have an MQi Plus Sport in the background. The first thing to talk about with these bikes is what NIU have done to the range since last year, since 2019. So last year there were 4 models. There was the U, which was a small model, about 18-mile range, 25 mile an hour, pretty small dimensions. Then they had the M Plus, which is exactly the same apart from a tiny few differences to the MQi Plus Sport. Then they had the N, so the N1S as it was known, and then they had the NGT. This year, 2020, they've decided to vastly increase that range, but also rename the existing models. Okay, so a case in point is that this MQi Plus Sport is identical apart from a couple of things. A new seat cover with the logo, a new badge, and a new price. In other words, if you can still find an M Plus Sport, you can get the same bike for less money other than the badge and the seat cover. It is the same. On the U's, they have doubled up. They are now 2 U's. There are now numerous N's, and there are now 4 NGTs. Okay, so hopefully this won't confuse you too much, but the original NGT from 2019 became the NQi GT Pro. Okay, it's got 12-inch wheels. It had about 134 kilometer range, which was about 90 miles, something like that, or 80, let's say. 2 batteries made by Panasonic. So that's still exists. It's now called the NQi GT Pro. So then what they did was they bought out something called an NQi GT Sport. We don't get that in the UK, but it's 12-inch wheels and it's got a new battery from China called Eve. So that's enough said about that because we don't get it here in the UK, but it was essentially a 12-inch wheel bike, the same as the NQi GT Pro, but with Eve batteries rather than Panasonic. Then you've got this one, which is the NQiGTS Sport. And then you've got the NQiGTS Pro. So the differences between them are either battery or wheel size. Okay, so as I said, the original NGT was Panasonic batteries, 12-inch wheels. If you are shorter, I guess, and you want a lower ride height, 3 centimeters lower, then the only option for you is actually the NQi GT Pro. 79 centimeter ride height, Panasonic batteries, because we don't get the Eve battery version over here, as I said. The other two, this one and the other one, have got 14-inch wheels. This one has an Eve battery out of China. The other one has a Panasonic battery out of Japan. As an aside, what NIU are doing is testing the sort of market acceptance for Eve batteries, because they're probably moving across the entire range to Eve, which might happen this year or might be happening next year, something like that. Okay, that's what we've been told. So anyway, just remember, if you want a 12-inch wheel bike, it's the NQi GT Pro. Otherwise, you're on a 14-inch wheel bike, and then it's either the Eve battery or the Panasonic battery. Okay, and the ultimate impact of choosing one or the other is range and price. Okay, so this one is 3.1 kilowatt continuous power. Okay, in actual fact, just to confuse you more, they have actually put different power ratings, different continuous power ratings across some of the bikes as well. But this one is 3.1 kilowatt continuous power. Okay, so when you talk about power, you talk about minimum power, continuous power, and maximum power. Continuous power is the power you get quoted on your V5, on your registration document. And that means that it will continually put out 3.1 kilowatts for at least 30 seconds a minute. That's how they rate it. Okay, so this one is 3.1 kilowatts continuous power, which I would say is actually an impact of the battery. But if you read the spec sheets, some of the ones with Panasonic battery have also now changed to 3.1 continuous power as well. So that's not necessarily the case either. Okay, so that could be an impact of the controller being tweaked. Okay, so as you can see with 14-inch wheels, the hub motor, there's a bit of space around it. On the 12-inch wheels, there isn't. Going into the hub is actually the power lead. Okay, that's basically taking the current, feeding it into the motor. The only thing to remember about that is if you're having the back tyre changed, then this needs to be unclipped, fed through, so that they can take the wheel off. Okay, and the other thing to remember is do not, or they shouldn't put this in a machine to take the tyre off. They should do it by hand. Okay, so something else to remember. As you can see, the seats, as I mentioned, 2020 models have got a new seat covering, and they now have this logo. Under the seat, you have a telltale sign of whether you've got an Eve battery or a Panasonic battery. So 26 amp hour, and this blue cover represents Eve. Okay, you will see on the Panasonic ones it will say 35 amp hour, and unless they've changed it, this was I think red, or at least had red in it. Okay, so the way you do with charging is through this charger here. This actually isn't a cheap piece of kit. If you were to replace all of that, you're talking about £500. This is the main charging unit. If you wanted a second charging unit, that's about £275. Okay, so there are various ways of charging the bike. The easiest way is to take the this charging lead and plug it in to this port here. Okay, and then you've got 4 to 7 hours of time to take if the batteries were flat, which we typically suggest you do not do, unless you have to, obviously. So certainly if you're storing the bike for a long period of time, say you're not going to ride it during the winter, you should charge the batteries once a month regardless. So top them up to at least 80%. Charge them once a month anyway, just for an hour or so, just to keep them in best condition. Because of Corona, we have actually had at least one customer who left his bike for all 3 months and didn't charge them once, and that's an expensive mistake to make. Okay, so do keep that in mind. So simplest way to charge it is to go through here, plug it into that. You can close the lid, come back 4 hours later, and then you're done. You can obviously charge them off the bike. So you could charge one at a time using the same lead, or you can use this splitter. Okay, so what happens here is that this goes into this, and then these two ends go into each of the batteries. Okay, it's best not to have the batteries too far out of step in terms of their power. Okay, so because if you do, then the battery management system kicks in and tries to equalize the power coming out from both of the batteries, and until it does, it might put you down into restricted mode, which basically means 28 miles an hour. We'll come to that in a minute. Okay, so that's that. As you can see, the seat is big enough for two. When you now compare the two, especially with the M Plus, it might not show up so well on here, but this bike is now obviously bigger than a M. Okay, so See, the seat's big enough for two. You've got these little footrests here that you can use for the second person. There's a slight tip about putting these back. Push them in gently, don't push them in hard, else they'll just keep popping out. As you can see here, you've got two stands, so a centre stand and a side stand. Okay, and one of the other things you notice about one of these bikes is that because the second battery is under the floor, some people have commented that they're not so confident about this bike from a sort of going over speed humps, taking sharp corners perspective, because obviously you've had to make enough space in the floor pan to fit the second battery. Okay, because the second battery is in here. Okay, so something to consider. One advantage of having bigger wheels as well would be that obviously the bike is now generally higher up. As I said, the seat height on a 14-inch wheel bike is 82 centimetres, and it's 79 centimetres on the 12-inch wheeled version, and therefore the bike is riding 3 centimetres higher, which means that the clearance is 3 centimetres higher as well. Okay, so that's that. Okay, as you come around the front, again, as an aside, one of the other things that they have changed is they're sort of now standardising more on these two-tone colours. So black with red, black with white, or white with red is across the NQiGT series, but it's also now trickling into the NQi series as well. Okay, so they're actually eliminating some of the colour choices that they had last year. Okay, so when we come around the bike, hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay, so here you can see that there are 96% on the battery. So there's two batteries here. It's cloud connected, which means when you buy the bike, there is an app. And one of the advantages that NIU had, although it's diminishing now, is that they had an app which could do two main things: track the bike and check the bike. Okay, now the other brands are catching up. Super Socco do it, Ascol do it now as well. So that advantage isn't there as much, but it's still a good thing to have, because obviously if someone rides off with your bike, being able to track it is a good thing. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. This, as we're on to sort of things like that, obviously this bike also has an alarm, and it also has a steering lock. So having an alarm built in is actually an advantage over some brands. Ascol, not Super Socco, but Ascol don't have an alarm built into their bike as yet, even though they have the app. Okay, so the dash is pretty standard. Here you've got, you know, flashing. Well, they've added a flash button here now. There's a new flash button behind there at the front of the handlebars, but before you used to do that. They also have the famous or infamous indicator noise. There are actually 7 choices, and there are various places you can find to see that. One of the things that this bike does is it cancels the indicators for you if you do a turn of over 60 degrees. Okay, so basically when you do full left or right turns, you don't have to worry about the indicator, although obviously with that noise you won't forget about it anyway. This is your rear brake fluid cylinder. Okay, so it's hydraulic brakes front and back. Okay, so one of the things that you should keep an eye on is the level of oil in there. Potentially you can fix that yourself by just undoing those, going to Halfords, topping it all up, or at least keep an eye on it so that you can tell your mechanic that something needs to be done, or when you bring it back to us. Down here, again, hopefully you can see this, it has a sort of mandatory requirement now of having a USB port, bag hook. As you can see, it's quite wide, so you can, you know, I've done it myself, ridden with a bag between my legs and still have my feet on on the floor pan okay. So this bike is on. Obviously no noise because it's a hub bike and it's electric. The sort of magic button to enable things is this. Okay, and now you see that there's a ready on the dashboard. If that ready's not on, the throttle doesn't work. Okay. If it is, throttle works, no noise. So that is something to remember. You change your modes. So at the moment we're in E-Save, which is Eco if you like, and you can increase it by going up the modes to Sport mode. So as I was saying before, if you only have one battery or the batteries are a lot out of balance, then you won't get into Sport mode. You will only get into Dynamic, and Dynamic is 28 miles an hour. Okay, so you can ride this bike with one battery, but you will only get into Dynamic mode. But of course the flip side of that is you will have all the space under the seat because it has to use the battery under the floor. Okay, so if you wanted to just nip down the shops and thought, well, it's only just down the road, I'm not going to be going very far, or your other battery's on charge, you could leave that other battery out, stuff whatever it is that you want under the seat, and that's how it works. Okay. So one of the other things that they talk about with the new range is the light. So it's a halo. They call it the halo light because it's obviously round, looks like a bit like a halo. It's standard across their range. One thing to say about that though is, of course, that the light is in the body of the bike. So in other words, it's pointing where the body of the bike is pointing, not where your handlebars might be pointing. So there are other bikes that put the lights here, and you can still get a screen around it, of course, but they have the light in the handlebars. So if you're turning into a corner, then the light will be turning into the corner with you, rather than still facing forward. Niu argue that because their beam is so wide, that wouldn't make so much of a difference, but it is something that you might want to consider because it's a difference. Okay, so as you can see, quite a nice looking bike from the front, quite trendy. From the back, okay, so that's where your registration plate would go. So I think that just about covers it. As I said, it's 47 mile an hour top speed, which is the same across the board, whether you're using the EVE battery or the Panasonic or the 12-inch wheels or the 14-inch wheels. It's range that is affected by the 26 amp hour batteries in EVE, possibly a bit of acceleration just at the beginning, but probably negligible, I would say. So I hope that's been useful. Because this bike has the EVE batteries, it's also, as I said, more cost effective. So this one comes in just under £3,000. Okay, if you get into Panasonic, you're over that, sometimes by as much as £500 more. Okay, so it is something to consider. There's nothing to say that EVE are not as good as Panasonic. It's just, I guess, that they're an unknown quantity. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us, and thanks very much.